We're going to continue on where I left off last time. Last week, we talked that we're in the middle of the Exodus. Well, we're towards the end of the Exodus. We're at the end of Moses' life today. We're going to get through the death of Moses. We're going to start the Conquest. They had taken off from Sinai, the Hebrews. More complaining, more stories of the complaining and the punishments. We got to the bronze serpent and what the bronze serpent represented, how Jesus quoted about the bronze serpent, how that related to him. And we very briefly talked at the end about their actual entrance into the promised land. And with that, we did some reminders because we're going to talk about the conquest. We're going to take a little more time on the conquest. And the reason we did some reminders is because the conquest is like almost the number one issue people take with the Bible and Yahweh's dealings with humans in the Old Testament. And so this is what, I played one of the news clips that I saw like a couple weeks ago that was pretty fresh, where someone on mainstream TV is bringing up the conquest and how can you serve a God when this is the conquest and just the destruction of people. We talked about that a bit. So here are some reminders as we set up what the conquest is and what it means. There will always be conflict between Eve's children and the seed of the serpent. We talked about how in Genesis 3, that's one of the prophecies that when God is declaring things over the serpent and Adam and Eve, that's one of the things that he talks about. And we kind of contemplated, what is the seed of the serpent? Like, does Satan have actual children the way that Eve has actual children? And then we went forward into Genesis 6. We just briefly mentioned in Genesis 6, there was a rebellion of spiritual beings that wanted to have their own children. And they went to earth and did what they did to have their own children. And we end up with the dealings of Genesis 6. We have the disapproval of Yahweh, what that's doing to humanity, and these weird hybrid beings that the Bible calls the Nephilim. And we have the flood, which is a flood of justice that creates a blank slate, once again, for mankind's role and story. We get through the flood. Noah's son Ham gives in to rebellion. We talked about a little bit what Ham does. We see that Ham's son Canaan is cursed, and from Canaan's line comes Nimrod, who is mentioned in the same way that we talk about the Nephilim. Another possible inclusion from the spiritual realm happens. We're not entirely sure. That's speculation, but we do know that Nimrod was something special. Then we got to the Tower of Babel, and we see that Yahweh comes down with spiritual beings, and he divides humanity, destroys the tower, spreads them all out across the world. Looking at Deuteronomy 32, it appears that he hands them over to their own spiritual beings to help rule their nations. And we get ancient Egypt and ancient Babylon out of the line of Ham, who was the one that brought the curse. Cursed lines continue. People are spreading out. The nations are spreading out. The nations are doing their things. Yahweh takes a man from what we would consider somewhere in Sumeria named Abram, and he says he's going to make a nation of Abram. And that's how we get our Hebrew people. That's how we get our Jews, is out of Mr. Abraham and Sarah. He has children. Well, Abraham does have many children, but we focus on Isaac. Isaac has a kid, Jacob. Jacob's kids end up in Egypt because of famine. Through the works of Joseph, they enter Egypt nicely, and they're in Egypt, they're in slavery, they get out of slavery. We get to the Exodus. God has declared judgment on the gods of Egypt. He enacts a judgment on the gods of Egypt, and now we have the people going back to take the land that was promised to them. That's where we are. So there's a whole thing going on. There's that Sumerian Babylon of the past that the people know is wrong and they fear. There's the sin and the grossness of what was going on in Egypt. And those are two shadows that fall over these people. And they need to go back and take their land. And inside their land are remnants of people from Egypt and from Babylon. Those shadows are already in the land. When we talk about religions of the past, I would argue that the worship of Yahweh is distinctly different from the other religions. What we see with religion, and this is a whole thing that we could go down a different day, but Sumerian religion is kind of the grandfather of all of the pantheons. And what I mean by pantheons is I mean the family of gods, these spiritual beings that work over nations and over city-states that the people worship. Sumerian religion gives way to Hurrian or Horite religion, the Akkadian religion, the Babylonian religion, the Assyrian religion. So when you think about all of these baddies in the Bible, when they go up against the Hebrews, that's where the religion's coming from, is Sumer. Sumerian religion also gets out west, and it starts mixing with the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, which are your early Greeks. And so there are actually there's so many similarities between how they worshipped in the Promised Land and how the early Greeks were worshiping their gods. And that leads way to Greek mythology, and there's many, many similarities between all of that. And we know that the Romans just adopt onto the Greek mythology. So when you're talking about these families of gods, these spiritual beings, lowercase g's, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with this family that seems to be all over the ancient Near East, maybe taking different forms and different names, but remaining kind of the same in character and notions, if that makes sense. So I don't think that there's all these different ones. I think they just masquerade around as kind of their self as a different name. And we see this throughout history. For example, when Alexander the Great conquers the Promised Land and he gets into Canaan, as he's going through, he will stop at things, altars of Baal, so that he can worship his father Zeus, because he considers Baal to be the same as Zeus. There are things like this throughout all of history where we see these connections. So we have Yahweh doing damage to the Egyptian pantheon below, and we're going to see today part of this is Yahweh enacting judgment on gods up in the Promised Land also. Also, at the end of Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel, things are divided up, land is divided up. People are not supposed to be in this land. And by people, I also mean spiritual rulers are not supposed to be in this land. A lot of people, when they give you reasons for this conquest, we talked briefly about this last week, they'll give you reasons that this is just what we would call just war or justified warfare. That because God is sovereign, he can just choose to do this, which of course he can choose to do what he wants. He is God, he is sovereign. However, I believe that there are reasons. I believe that there are spiritually binding reasons that he's going to do what he does, and the way that needs to be taken seriously. This is my opinions, this is based on research, a lot of things that I've looked into and studied. I think there's primarily three reasons that they go hard when they go in to take the Promised Land. And that is, I think that there needs to be more of we already know that we don't like these Nephilim things and that the earth should not have these on them. So there's going to be the destruction of giants, Rephaim, Nephilim. All of those kind of mean the same thing. In the Septuagint, Nephilim is translated giant. So, I mean, that's the Greek. It's the Greek look at that. The Rephaim we're going to talk about in a little bit, but the same family of things. That culture and the religious, specifically those religious practices, have to be destroyed. Judgments of that pantheon, I think he's taking judgment on these lowercase g gods the same way that he's taking judgment on the gods of Egypt when he left Egypt. And the land of Israel is for the Hebrews, and it is to be sacred space before Yahweh. And we've talked a little bit about sacred space. We've talked about last week, we even mentioned unclean and clean and how that relates to worship in space. That's kind of what's going on here too, is this idea that the nation is to be holy and without these corruptible things. Let's talk a little bit about the religious practices that are going on in Canaan at this time. There are human sacrifices abounding, child and adult. We've talked in the past about Baal. We've talked about the giant metal thing where they place the baby inside and they heat it up, and they actually just fry the baby in the altar of Baal. And if you do that enough times, and if you do that every year, Baal is going to bless and do all these different things for you. Moloch was the same. Moloch and Baal, you can kind of equivalate. It's just gross. It's just gross. And they would even do that with adults. Sometimes if you needed to win a war, and we see this in Chronicles, one of the kings does this in the book of Chronicles, but they were doing it earlier. If you need to win a war, sometimes the king would even just have to sacrifice his own son in order for the god to show up in battle and bring forth the victory needed. This is also why I think it's one of the lessons that the Hebrews get through the story of Abraham and Isaac. When Abraham takes Isaac up to be sacrificed and God says no, Yahweh is making clear, I see your faithfulness, but I am not like these others. I am different than these others, and I will not demand this of you, and this is wrong. And I think that there's a faith testing there, but I also think that it's Yahweh communicating in a story that will be passed down generations. Don't kill your children. Don't do this. There's a number of ritual sex magic that was going on, and we won't get deeply into that. Still a thing. Still a thing in our community. Fertility rites, the idea that you have to give offerings in order for God to provide you with certain things, and you had to do all this, and then a lowercase g God would take care of things. Ancestral worship, they would worship their ancestors. The idea of pouring out a drink for your homie actually goes back 4,000 years to when people would visit graves and pour liquids and libations out over a grave so that their ancestor would be able to partake and you would worship with the ancestor. So it gets back. Of course, there's temple worship. There's just temples to these beings that people were engaging in. This stuff can't stand inside the nation of Israel. Israel is to be sacred space before Yahweh, and the people are not to do this inside the borders of Israel. I don't know how well you can see that up there today, where that's kind of the line of battle that we're going to go through. It's very, again, this screen. You got the Dead Sea down there in the bottom, and you have the Sea of Galilee at the top, just to kind of give you a geographic look. So they're outside. They're not actually going to make it into Israel today, but they're going to take care of what's on the outside. They're not allowed to enter through their neighbors, as we'll read, because their cousins and brothers of history will not let them through. So this is the route that they're going to take. Let's start with some Bible here. Deuteronomy 2. And so we passed by our brothers, the descendants of Esau, who lived in Seir, past the road of the Arabah from Elath and Ezion Geber. Don't worry about all the places. I just want you to take the notions of what's going on. So they're going north. They're going around. They're going around Moab. And Yahweh said to me, you shall not attack Moab, and you shall not engage in war with them, for I will not give you any of his land as a possession. I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession. The Emim previously lived in it, a people large and numerous and tall, like the Anakites. They were reckoned also as Rephaim, as the Anakites were, but the Moabites called them Emim. The Horites previously lived in Seir, but the descendants of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from among themselves, as Israel did with respect to the land of their possession that Yahweh gave to them. So just stopping right there. When Esau went to take his land, Esau also had to fight Rephaim and kill all the giants and take the land. So this is a story of old, and this is what's going to happen again with Israel. So Esau, blessed by Yahweh, goes to take his land, also has to go kill all these giant people. Whether all the people were giant, I don't really know. I have more of the opinion that the giants were actually kind of rare and probably were the leaders of the nations, as they were the sons of those gods. So I kind of think that whole divine monarchy idea is there. So I don't think it's just like thousands of giants lining up in battle to go fight normal people. I think they're giant-led nations. Yahweh spoke to me as they were going. You are about to cross over the land of Moab, today at Ar. When you approach the border of the Ammonites, you shall not harass them, and you shall not get involved in battle with them, for I have given the land of the Ammonites. For I have not given the land of the Ammonites to you as possession, because I gave it to the descendants of Lot as a possession. It is also considered the land of Rephaim. The Rephaim lived in it previously, and the Ammonites called them the Zamzummim. It's kind of a fun name. A people great and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. Yahweh destroyed them from before them, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place. So when Lot's family eventually settled in its place, they also had to go in and kill all the giants and wipe them out. Do you see a pattern here? Going to the word, the Rephaim, a Hebrew word often simply transliterated in modern English Bibles. Transliterated means they just kind of take it. They don't necessarily try to work their own magic with it or make it their own. They just take the word, borrow it from another language. Some places in the Old Testament, it's rendered giants. Other places, it's shades, which is basically spirits of the dead. It would be kind of what we consider ghosts. Or simply the dead. These translation choices point to the interpretive problem that's associated with the term Rephaim. It's difficult to identify whether the Rephaim were humans, living or dead, quasi-divine figures, or disembodied spirits. Most of the words that we use from royalty, that we discern from like the Middle East, the ancient Near East, actually the ref and the rough part of the royal words come back to Rephaim, this idea of the Rephaim. The Rapu, different names for all the kings. So it's kind of interesting that here's something that's still in our culture we use when we talk about regal and royal and stuff like that. The symbol words come back from that. It's kind of, here we are 4,000 years later. And then, so going back to that Deuteronomy 2 passage, Esau's, it'd be his great-great-great-grandchildren anyway, brothers and cousins to them, will not let them pass through their land. They will let them go around. They will not come out to attack them, but they will not let them go through. Same with Lot's family. So they have to go around, which means they can't go right up through, like kind of cross between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee and just go right in and do battle and take their land. They're going to have to go up and around to do it. Now, I think this is a provision of Yahweh. Yahweh is going to deal with the people that are north of those two countries. Numbers. Then Israel sent messages to Sihon, king of the Amorites. This would be right north of where Lot's people live. Let me pass through your land. We will not turn aside into any field or vineyard. We will not drink the water of the well. We will go by the king's highway until we have passed through your territory. The territory that this portion of the Amorites are in were not given to them. The land was not given to them by Yahweh originally when you read the promise. But Sihon would not allow Israel to pass through his territory. He gathered all of his people together and went out against Israel to the wilderness and came to Jahaz and fought against Israel. And Israel defeated him with the edge of the sword and took possession of his land from Arnon to the Jabbok as far as to the Ammonites, for the border of the Ammonites was strong. So basically they took everything from where Lot's people were up to a certain point. And then Deuteronomy 2 is just expressing the same story. It appears twice, once in Deuteronomy, once in Numbers. This has slightly different language, which will make you think back to Pharaoh in Egypt. It'll say, but the Sihon, the king of Heshbon, would not let us pass by, for the Lord your God hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate. Sounds like exactly what happened with Pharaoh, right? When God was going to enact judgment there. That he might give him into your hand as he is this day. And the Lord said to me, behold, I have begun to give Sihon and his land over to you. Begin to take possession that you may occupy his land. So Sihon is the king of the Amorites there in the south. And when Sihon came out against us, he and all his people, to battle at Jahaz, the Lord gave him over to us, and we defeated him and his sons and all of his people. We captured all of his cities at the time and devoted to destruction every city, man, woman, and child. We left no survivors. So here's one of those passages that people don't like, the absolute destruction, annihilation of this place. Only the livestock we took as spoils for ourselves with the plunder of the cities that we captured. From Aor, which is on the edge of the valley of Arnon, and from the city that is on the valley as far as Gilead, there was not a city too high for us. The Lord our God gave all into our hands. Only to the lands of the sons of Ammon you did not draw near. That's Lot's family again. That is to the banks of the river, Jabbok, and all the cities of the hill country, whatever the Lord our God had forbidden us. So Sihon, we don't get anything word right here in the passages about him being a giant. But then if we go read Amos 2, when it talks about this destruction and this invasion, Yahweh is speaking through Amos to the people of Israel. This is one of the later prophets. Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before you, the Amorite being a single, and I think they're talking about the king, destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars and who was as strong as the oaks. I destroyed his fruit above and his roots beneath. Also it was I who brought you up out of the land of Egypt and led you 40 years in the wilderness to possess the land of the Amorite. And Israel took all these cities, and Israel settled in all the cities of the Amorites in Heshbon and in its villages. For Heshbon was the city of Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who had fought against the former king of Moab and had taken out all of his land from his hand as far as Arnon. Therefore the ballad singers say, we'll read the ballad in a second. So Moab, which we already talked about being, that was part of the Esau and Lot group, they were already having problems with these giant kings. And Israel is actually going to take care of their problem. This is just a ballad that they actually find written in another place outside of the Bible too, talking about the destruction of the city. What's interesting is in the last 100 years, so many of these places and names and God names that we found that are in this Old Testament that we read have actually been discovered in other articles. So with Moab and Chemosh, the name, their god is Chemosh. We didn't have a whole lot about that until the last, I don't know exactly when, it was within the last 100 years. They found a giant monument and they decrypted it, and it talks about Chemosh. And it talks about Chemosh coming to give strength to battle over the Hebrew people. So like all this stuff is actually historically found other places, which is interesting to know because back in the 1800s, people would destroy the Bible in theory and thought because all these places aren't found in history. And well, now we've found all of this stuff. Talking about Chemosh real quick. Chemosh is the destroyer. He was a god of war. He's mentioned 8 times in the Old Testament. The Moabite stone, written by Mesha, 9th century BC king of Moab, mentions Chemosh as the deity who brought victory to the Moabites in battle against the Israelites. And we'll see that. That's a story that happens in Chronicles. Ruth is from Moab. Everybody knows Ruth. She's David's great-great, I believe, grandma. Ruth and Boaz. Ruth would have grown up worshiping Chemosh before she switched over to Yahweh. Solomon's going to build a temple or an altar to Chemosh. That's part of Solomon's decline when he starts building all these monument grossness in Israel in that sacred space that's not supposed to be there. And Josiah will eventually destroy it. Our Josiah is a builder, not a destroyer, but that's all right. Thus Israel lived in the land of the Amorites, and Moses sent to spy out Jazer, and they captured its villages and dispossessed the Amorites who were there. And then they turned and went up by the way of Bashan. And Og and the king of Bashan came out to battle against them, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. Og is not going to even give them a chance to talk. King Og is coming to battle. King Og is feared. King Og is mentioned in other texts in ancient Near East literature, also as a giant. It's not just a Torah thing. But the Lord said to Moses, do not fear Og, for I have given him into your hand and all his people and his land. And you shall do to him what you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon. So they defeated him and his sons and all his people until he had no survivor left. And they possessed his land. Just a reminder, Bashan is up towards where we would call the Golan Heights today. So you're getting up there closer to like where Syria's little point touches down. Bashan was all the land. It even touched the Sea of Galilee up to Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon is where Jesus did the transfiguration. It's also where Caesarea Philippi is when Jesus goes to talk about the gates of the underworld that will be dispossessed because of his people. That was all of Og's land called Bashan. Bashan means place of the serpent. And so they're going in to conquer. There's that symbolism there again. You have the giants, you have the serpents, and Moses is doing that. Jesus, when he does his trip up to Caesarea Philippi, follows a route similar, that he does the transfiguration on Mount Bashan, or on Mount Hermon in Bashan, the place of the serpent, and it's just reminiscent of Moses' journey going up and killing the giant up there too. So there's that symbolism that's coming with Jesus' journey and beating these things. Just a reminder, when we talked about Nephilim before, we talked about the Jewish temple thought. That's where demons come from. What we would consider demons is the leftover spirits of the Nephilim. Remember that we've said there's many different spiritual beings, different types. Second Temple Jewish, that's where you get the unclean spirit, again, because the spirits were mixed. So when Jesus is kicking demons' butts as we go through Luke, most of the time he's talking about kicking out these unclean spirits, these leftover spirits, these mixed, hybrid, gross things that should not have existed. He does encounter a different spirit. There's that point where Jesus has to take out the spiritual being that's thwarting the disciples, and he's like, this one's different. You need prayer and fasting for this one because it's a different thing. So that's a different spiritual being. So just another connotation. You have unclean spirits, leftover Nephilim. We've talked about this a lot, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. That's also part of Jesus' journey north, is also kicking out these leftover spirits of the giants that the original Hebrews killed. So it's like the cycle. That's what the Messiah was going to do. We talk about typology a little bit. We always talk about Moses being a type of Christ. We always talk about Joshua being a type of Christ, and we talk about David being a type of Christ. All three of them are figures that went around killing giants. Just an interesting tidbit. Thus Israel lived in the land of Amorites, and Moses sent to spy out Jazer, and they captured its villages. They went up to Og. Do not fear them. We talked this. Deuteronomy gives the same story. They're going up to Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us. Og had a pretty big empire, 60 cities, the whole region of Argob, the kingdom of Og and Bashan. And these were cities fortified with high walls, gates, and bars, besides very many unwalled villages. Why do you need super high walls? Just in case other giant kings are going to come attack your giant king. So the walls were bigger. Part of the reason Jericho, they make the big story about the giant walls of Jericho, they were bigger than normal, is because you have giant warfare. Moving on, and we devoted them to destruction. There's that phrase again, as we did to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, devoting to destruction every city, man, woman, and child. All the livestock and spoils of the city we took it as plunder. So they're just going through this again, this whole idea. From the valley of Arnon to Mount Hermon, the Sidonians called Hermon Syrian, where the Amorites call it Senir. All the cities of the tableland, and all Gilead, and all Bashan, as far as more cities' names, the kingdom of Bashan. So they're just going through historical record. For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim, which I think are those giant kings. His bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubit was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit. So, why are they describing this bed? That was a question for like 2,000 years. Okay, we get it's a giant bed. It's a giant bed. It actually, cubits, it measures to like 13 and a half feet long, 6 feet wide. It is a massive bed. Let's talk a little bit about why the bed is important. We didn't know about this until, again, within the last couple hundred years, we figured out why this bed is important. What are they trying to do? The bed. First, the most immediate link back to the Babylonian polemic, is Og's bed. Its dimensions, 9 by 4 cubits, are precisely those of the cultic bed in the ziggurat called Entemenaki, which is the ziggurat most archaeologists identify as the Tower of Babel, referred to in the Bible. Ziggurats functioned as temples and divine abodes. We've talked about ziggurats before as we've been going through this whole journey of the Bible. It's the giant building temple, and Temenaki was the biggest one. It was in Babylon. I've got reconstructed pictures to show you. There was a level where there was the house of the bed, and that's where the king would go up and meet with the god and the goddess, and the king would hope that the one god would possess him so that he could have sex with a priestess of the temple and produce a half spiritual being, half human thing. And so what they're doing is the Hebrews were drawing this back. See, Og was of Babylon. He was of that evil. He was of that shadow. And so that's kind of where they're going through with it. A reconstruction of ancient Babylon. This would not be the new Babylon, but this is the ancient Babylon, the Sumerian Babylon. We've talked a little bit about the Gate of Ishtar there. Nice blue, you go through, and then that big building in the back would have been the Ziggurat and Tamanaki, which would look like that. Your bed would be up at the top, where the gods, the spiritual beings, would come down and meet with you, and bad things would happen. And so the Hebrews are very much aware of the history of what is going on and the bad people and the bad things that are happening. And they're letting you know that, like, we even found this in Og's house, that this was still a practice that Og brought from the ancients over. We didn't even know exactly where this was until, it was about 120 years ago they found it. They've been slowly digging some stuff out, but it's very destroyed. This is about all that's left of what used to be the ancient capital of Babylon. So you can see some of the brickwork there. But what they did is they were able to discover more and more things with cuneiform, which is the old language of the Sumerians. They were actually to find out there's books of magic that still exist, books of the rituals and everything that they used to do on seals and cylinders and all these different things. And it's just like these things of the Bible come alive. And you're like, this is exactly like the bed that was in this wonder of the world. That's why they're throwing it in there, because we just didn't know that. We just thought it was a weird giant bed for so many years. And so, that's just one thing with this is the Bible just keeps getting checked out. And you keep finding that a lot of this stuff is there. They take these two nations, they put these giant kingdoms to death. They've taken the land, wasn't originally supposed to be theirs, but it was taken as judgment. When Joshua starts dividing people, he will give them to different tribes, and it will become part of that era of Israel. He's going to get up there, and he's going to see from a high height what we're going to talk about here, and then he's going to pass away after taking out the two giant kings. There's more giants that Joshua's going to take out, but they're not in the line of the Rephaim, meaning they're not in the line of those giant kings of old. So Moses is going to pass away. This is where we'll end today. And then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite of Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of the Judah as far as the western sea, the Negeb and the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees as far as Zoar. And the Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley of the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died, and his eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. And then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid hands on him. So there's that, one of the earliest practices of the laying on of hands and asking for the wisdom. And some people like to throw the mantle around. I'm not sure I like the idea of mantle. But there's definitely the idea of laying on hands and praying for people to receive. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all of his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sights of all of Israel. And so Moses is leaving our Sunday school stories. He has accomplished what he needs to accomplish, and Joshua is going to take over. You could do a whole study on how Joshua was prepared to take over, and there's lessons to be learned there, but we're just going to focus on the stories. Moses gets the 2 big battles in before his death, but he is not allowed to cross over the Jordan. And so that brings us to the end of Moses. And that starts the conquest. We haven't actually made it into the land that was promised, but we took out all the hostility around where the source of these evil things were coming from. So hopefully that makes a little more sense when we just read that they devoted it all to destruction and killed it all and burned it all. Yet it's not just they were taking, that land wasn't even for them originally. That wasn't like, this is our land, give us our land. This was divine punishment to take care of things that should not have been there, things that are not supposed to be on earth. So hopefully that makes sense. That gives you a little bit of historical record on that. We'll start up with Joshua. Joshua's going to do similar things, but that's another day. So let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you that you have always been victorious. Yahweh, you have always been bigger and better than any other spiritual being. You are the Most High. We love you and we worship you. We consider you our Father, brought back by King Jesus. Lord, today I just ask that we would look at our lives, that we would evaluate all that we do in our home, all that we do with our hands and with our mind. And Lord, I would just ask that we evaluate and make sure that we don't give room to any other influence that is not you. Lord, the New Testament, you call the idea of sacred space, our body as a temple. Lord, help us to live like that. To be only loyal to you and to bring your kingdom into our community, to fight against the deeds of the seeds of the serpent. May you find loyalty when you return. In your name we pray, Jesus. We love you. Amen.